The old man sat alone at the defendant's table, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he shuffled through papers he barely understood. Across the aisle, 5 lawyers in $1,000 suits whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing his way with barely concealed amusement. One actually smirked. He had no attorney, no representation, no chance. The corporate team had already prepared their victory speech. This would be over in minutes. A simple foreclosure case against a confused elderly veteran who thought he could represent himself against one of the city's most powerful law firms. But what none of them knew, what the smirking lawyers couldn't have imagined, was that at that very moment, a Marine colonel was racing through traffic, still wearing his dress blues from a ceremony he'd abandoned the second he heard the name Eduardo Garcia read over a courthouse scanner. And in less than 3 minutes, those confident lawyers would discover that the quiet old man they'd been mocking had once pulled their opponent from a burning Humvee under enemy fire. Today, that debt would be repaid. Welcome to the Veteran Voices, where we uncover the extraordinary moments hidden in ordinary lives. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? Your engagement means everything to us, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who understand that heroism doesn't always wear a cape, and your support helps us share these powerful moments with the world. The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Lawyers hurried past security with overstuffed briefcases, their polished shoes clicking against marble floors that had witnessed decades of justice served and denied. In courtroom 7B, a different kind of battle was about to unfold. Eduardo Garcia arrived early, as he had every morning for the past 43 years of civilian life. Military habits die hard, especially when they're the only reliable thing left in a world that seemed determined to take everything else away. He wore his best shirt, a faded blue button-down his late wife Maria had bought him for their anniversary 3 years ago. The collar was slightly frayed, but it was clean and pressed with the same precision he'd once applied to his Marine dress uniforms. The papers in his manila folder told a story of systematic betrayal. For 18 months, Metropolitan Benefits Corporation had been deducting payments from his veterans' disability compensation for a supplemental insurance policy he'd never requested. When he tried to cancel it, they claimed he'd signed a binding contract. When he asked to see the contract, they said their records showed he'd received it electronically to an email address he'd never owned. Eduardo had tried calling their customer service line dozens of times, sitting on hold for hours while automated voices assured him his call was important. When he finally reached human beings, they transferred him in circles until the line went dead. He'd written letters on notebook paper, his careful handwriting explaining his situation with the patience of a man who'd spent decades following proper channels. The responses came back stamped with legal jargon that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The breaking point came when they garnished his account for breach of contract fees. $1,200, money he needed for his heart medication, gone overnight. That's when Eduardo learned that taking on a corporation meant taking on their army of lawyers, and he couldn't afford even one. So here he sat, 71 years old, representing himself against Metropolitan Benefits Corporation and their legal team that probably cost more per hour than he received in a month. The opposing counsel table looked like a war room. 5 attorneys in matching Navy suits, each carrying leather portfolios that probably cost more than Eduardo's monthly rent. Their leader, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Vance, had built her career defending corporations against frivolous lawsuits from elderly clients who couldn't navigate the maze of modern contract law. She'd reviewed Garcia's case file with the kind of clinical detachment that came from handling hundreds of similar matters. Elderly veteran, fixed income, no legal representation. The pattern was always the same. These cases settled quickly once the plaintiffs realized what they were up against. Her team had prepared a standard motion to dismiss, backed by precedent cases and technical contract language that would overwhelm any pro-SE defendant. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered at exactly 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing as she took the bench. She'd seen cases like this before, David versus Goliath, except David usually left his sling at home. She respected veterans, truly did, but the law was the law, and good intentions didn't override binding contracts. Eduardo stood when the bailiff announced the judge's entrance, his posture still carrying traces of military bearing despite his age. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq, earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and spent the better part of his adult life believing that following the rules and telling the truth would be enough. He was about to learn otherwise. The court will hear case number CV 2024-187, Garcia versus Metropolitan Benefits Corporation, Judge Hendricks announced, settling behind the bench with the weary efficiency of someone who'd presided over too many one-sided battles. Patricia Vance rose gracefully, her confidence filling the courtroom like expensive perfume. Your Honor, Patricia Vance representing Metropolitan Benefits Corporation. We're joined today by Associates Davis, Fletcher, Morgan, and Chin. Each lawyer nodded in turn, a choreographed display of legal firepower. Eduardo stood more slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the suddenly quiet room. Eduardo Garcia, representing myself, Your Honor. The contrast was almost comical. On one side, a fortress of legal expertise backed by unlimited resources. On the other, an elderly man with a folder of handwritten notes and a faith in justice that was about to be tested. Judge Hendricks reviewed her notes. Mr. Garcia, I see you filed a complaint alleging fraudulent charges and unauthorized contract enrollment. Ms. Vance, your client has filed a motion to dismiss based on binding arbitration clauses. Let's begin with. Your Honor, Vance interrupted with practiced timing. Before we proceed, I'd like to address the frivolous nature of this complaint. Mr. Garcia has consistently ignored proper dispute resolution channels outlined in his service agreement. Our records clearly show electronic acceptance of terms, multiple email confirmations, and documented attempts to resolve this matter through our customer service department. She gestured to a stack of documents that appeared overnight on her table like legal magic. Eduardo's stomach sank as he realized he was looking at evidence he'd never seen before: printouts of email exchanges he'd supposedly had, digital signatures he'd supposedly made, phone call logs showing conversations he'd supposedly participated in. Furthermore, Vance continued, Mr. Garcia's military service, while admirable, doesn't exempt him from contractual obligations he freely entered into. The law applies equally to all citizens. The phrase stung because it was true in the worst possible way. Eduardo had spent his entire adult life believing in equal justice, never imagining that equality could be weaponized against those who couldn't afford to fight back. Judge Hendricks turned to Eduardo. Mr. Garcia, you'll have an opportunity to respond to these allegations. Do you have documentation supporting your claims? Eduardo's hand shook slightly as he opened his folder. Inside were handwritten copies of the letters he'd sent, bank statements showing the unauthorized charges, and medical records proving his need for the money they'd taken. Compared to the mountain of glossy evidence across the aisle, his materials looked like children's homework. Your Honor, I never signed up for any insurance policy. I never received any emails because I don't have email. I've been trying to get this fixed for over a year, but they keep taking my money anyway. One of Vance's associates, Fletcher, according to his business card, leaned forward with the predatory interest of a shark smelling blood. Your Honor, our client has electronic records showing Mr. Garcia's IP address accessing our enrollment portal on March 15, 2023. The digital signature matches patterns established through his previous interactions with our customer service system. Eduardo's confusion was visible to everyone in the courtroom. IP addresses, digital signatures, enrollment portals, these weren't concepts that existed when he learned to navigate the world. He was a man who still wrote checks by hand and kept his important papers in a shoebox, facing opponents who fought with weapons he couldn't even name. I don't know what any of that means, he said quietly. I just know they're taking money I never agreed to give them. The corporate lawyers exchanged glances that might have been subtle if they hadn't been sitting 20 feet away from their target. This was going exactly as they'd expected. In 30 minutes, maybe less, they'd have their dismissal, their billable hours, and their victory over another confused elderly plaintiff who dared to challenge the system. Judge Hendricks was flipping through the motion to dismiss when the courtroom doors opened with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Everyone turned. A Marine colonel in full dress blue stood in the doorway, his uniform immaculate, his bearing unmistakably military. Ribbons covered his chest in neat rows. Combat Action Ribbon, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Iraq Campaign Medal, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, and others that Eduardo recognized from his own service days. The man's face was stern but not unkind, and his eyes were scanning the courtroom with the tactical awareness of someone who'd learned to assess situations quickly and completely. He walked down the center aisle with measured steps, his polished shoes silent on the carpet, his presence commanding attention from everyone in the room. Patricia Vance's confident expression faltered for the first time all morning. Her associates stopped whispering. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine. The colonel stopped at the rail separating the gallery from the courtroom proper and spoke in a voice that carried authority without being loud. "Your Honor, I request permission to approach the bench." Judge Hendricks, clearly caught off guard, nodded slowly. "State your name and business, Colonel." "Colonel James Mitchell, United States Marine Corps, currently assigned to the Judge Advocate General's Corps at Quantico." He stepped forward, placing a leather portfolio on the counsel table next to Eduardo's humble folder. "Your Honor, I request permission to represent Mr. Garcia in this matter." The silence that followed was the kind that makes people hold their breath. Eduardo stared at the colonel, recognition dawning slowly in his weathered features. The face was older, marked by years and responsibility, but the eyes were the same ones that had looked back at him from a stretcher in a field hospital outside Fallujah 20 years ago. Judge Hendricks found her voice first. "Colonel Mitchell, while I appreciate your desire to assist, I'll need to see your credentials for practicing in this jurisdiction." Mitchell reached into his portfolio and produced a leather folder containing certificates and bar admissions from 3 states, including Arizona. Harvard Law School, 1999. 25 years of military justice experience, including complex contract litigation. Recently admitted to practice in Arizona specifically for this case, Your Honor. He handed the documents to the bailiff, then turned to face the corporate legal team with a look that made Patricia Vance suddenly very interested in the papers on her table. "I should also mention," Mitchell continued, "that Mr. Garcia saved my life in Iraq. Today, I'm here to return the favor." The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and palpable. What had been a routine corporate dismissal 60 seconds earlier was now something else entirely, a confrontation between professional predators and someone who spoke their language fluently. Colonel Mitchell didn't just take his seat at the defense table. He commanded it. His presence changed the entire geometry of the room. Eduardo, who had appeared isolated and overwhelmed moments before, now sat beside someone who radiated the kind of quiet competence that comes from decades of high-stakes decision-making. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to being heard the first time, "I've reviewed the complaint and the motion to dismiss. Before we proceed, I'd like to request that all evidence presented by the plaintiff be authenticated according to Federal Rules of Evidence 901 and 902. Patricia Vance's confident expression cracked like thin ice. Authentication requirements were typically waived in cases involving pro-se defendants who couldn't challenge technical evidence. But Mitchell wasn't a confused elderly veteran. He was a Harvard-trained attorney with 2 decades of military legal experience, and he'd just transformed a routine dismissal into a potential nightmare. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, "I'm filing a motion for sanctions under Rule 11 for frivolous pleadings, and I'm putting opposing counsel on notice that we'll be seeking attorney's fees under the Arizona Consumer Fraud Act." The corporate team went into immediate huddle mode, their whispered conference carrying the urgency of soldiers under fire. Fletcher was rapidly typing on his laptop, probably researching the cases Mitchell had just cited. Davis was flipping through documents, looking for authentication they'd never bothered to obtain. Morgan was on his phone, presumably calling their office for backup. Judge Hendricks, suddenly very alert, addressed Mitchell directly. "Colonel, these are serious allegations. Are you prepared to substantiate claims of fraudulent evidence?" "I am, Your Honor." Mitchell opened his portfolio and produced a stack of documents that made Vance's evidence pile look amateurish. "I've subpoenaed the defendant corporation's complete digital records regarding Mr. Garcia's account, including server logs, IP address registrations, and authentication protocols. I've also retained a digital forensics expert who will testify that the supposed electronic signatures attributed to my client are fabricated." Eduardo watched this exchange like a man witnessing a miracle. The same lawyers who had been smirking at him minutes earlier now looked like students who hadn't studied for a final exam. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had completely reversed. "Your Honor," Vance said, her voice no longer carrying its earlier confidence, "we object to these procedural delays. Our client's contract with Mr. Garcia is straightforward and legally binding." Mitchell turned to face her with the kind of smile that probably terrified opposing counsel in military courts. "Ms. Vance, I'm curious about something. According to your client's records, Mr. Garcia supposedly enrolled in this insurance policy using an email address registered to a Gmail account created on the same day. That Gmail account has no other activity, no other emails sent or received, no password changes, no login attempts from any location other than your client's offices in Delaware." The color drained from Vance's face. She clearly hadn't expected anyone to dig that deep into the digital evidence. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, the IP address allegedly used by Mr. Garcia to access your enrollment portal traces back to a commercial internet cafe in Phoenix that closed permanently in 2019, for years before this supposed enrollment took place. Fletcher stopped typing. Davis stopped flipping through papers. Morgan ended his phone call. The corporate legal team was experiencing the courtroom equivalent of a military ambush, and they had no defensive position to fall back to. Judge Hendricks leaned forward. Ms. Vance, are you prepared to respond to these allegations? Vance's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Her entire case had just been demolished by someone who understood both the law and the technology her client had used to defraud elderly veterans. The fabricated evidence, the manufactured digital signatures, the phantom email accounts, all of it was about to be exposed in a way that could result in criminal charges, not just civil penalties. Your Honor, she finally managed. We'd like to request a brief recess to confer with our client. Motion denied, Judge Hendricks said firmly. Colonel Mitchell, please continue. Mitchell stood and walked to the center of the courtroom, his military bearing making him appear taller than his actual height. Your Honor, Metropolitan Benefits Corporation has engaged in a systematic scheme to defraud elderly veterans by creating fictitious electronic contracts, manufacturing digital evidence, and using the complexity of modern technology to steal from people who serve their country with honor. He gestured toward Eduardo. Mr. Garcia spent 2 tours in Iraq, earned a Purple Heart defending this nation, and came home to a country that promised to take care of its veterans. Instead, he found predators wearing business suits instead of enemy uniforms, stealing his disability payments through lies and fabricated documents. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the software of the air conditioning and the faint scratching of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. This isn't just contract fraud, Your Honor. This is theft from a disabled veteran, aggravated by the use of sophisticated technology to create false evidence. Under Arizona law, that's not just grounds for dismissal of their motion, it's grounds for criminal prosecution. Judge Hendricks looked at the corporate lawyers with an expression that could have frozen water. Ms. Vance, I'm going to ask you directly. Are you prepared to stipulate that your client's evidence regarding Mr. Garcia's electronic enrollment is fabricated? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Vance looked at her team, at her client's representatives who had suddenly found urgent business outside the courtroom, and at the Marine colonel who had just destroyed months of careful legal preparation in 15 minutes. Your Honor, she said quietly, we'd like to withdraw our motion to dismiss and enter into settlement negotiations. The settlement conference lasted 3 hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. Metropolitan Benefits Corporation, facing potential criminal charges and a federal investigation into their practices, agreed to terms that went far beyond simple restitution. Eduardo Garcia would receive full compensation for all unauthorized charges, plus interest and attorney's fees. More importantly, the company would establish a fund to compensate other veterans who had been similarly defrauded, and they would implement new verification procedures to prevent future targeting of elderly clients. But the numbers, significant as they weren't what mattered most in the corridor outside courtroom 7B. Eduardo stood with Colonel Mitchell, 2 Marines separated by decades but connected by something stronger than time. The courthouse crowd had dispersed, the corporate lawyers had fled with their tails between their legs, and the afternoon sun was streaming through tall windows that had witnessed countless moments of justice delayed and denied. Jamie, Eduardo said quietly, using the name he'd known 20 years ago when both men were younger and the world was a simpler place. How did you know? Mitchell smiled, not the predatory grin he'd shown the corporate lawyers, but something warmer and more genuine. I've got Google alerts set up for the names of everyone from my unit. When I saw Eduardo Garcia and federal court in the same headline, I knew something was wrong. You never would have ended up in court unless someone was trying to rob you. You came all the way from Virginia. I flew out last night, took leave, rearranged a dozen meetings, and probably pissed off half the Pentagon. Mitchell's expression grew serious. Eddie, do you remember what you told me in that field hospital after you pulled me out of the Humvee? Eduardo shook his head. He'd been running on adrenaline and morphine, and most of that day remained a blur of smoke and shouting. You said Marines don't leave Marines behind. That applies in courtrooms too. They walked toward the exit together, their footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. Eduardo moved more slowly than he had that morning, not from fatigue, but from the weight of relief, the kind that comes when you realize you're not fighting alone anymore. At the courthouse steps, Mitchell handed Eduardo a business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. If anyone else tries to mess with you, you call me immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it yourself. There are more predators out there, and they're counting on veterans being too proud or too confused to fight back. Eduardo pocketed the card, knowing he'd probably never need to use it but grateful beyond words that he could. What can I do to repay you? You already did, Mitchell said. 20 years ago in Fallujah. Today, I just returned the favor. As the colonel walked away, Eduardo remained on the courthouse steps, watching the late afternoon traffic and thinking about the strange circles life draws around people. He'd gone to war as a young man, come home broken in ways that weren't visible, and spent 2 decades believing he'd left his service behind. Today, he'd learned otherwise. The uniform doesn't make the Marine, the commitment does. And sometimes that commitment shows up in unexpected places, wearing business suits instead of combat gear, fighting battles in courtrooms instead of desert towns, proving that some bonds are stronger than time and distance and all the things that try to separate people who've shared something larger than themselves. Eduardo walked to his old pickup truck, started the engine that coughed like an old man clearing his throat, and drove home to a quiet house where he'd sleep better than he had in months. Tomorrow he'd call his nephew in California, maybe his sister in El Paso, and tell them about the day a Marine colonel walked into a courtroom and reminded the world that some debts are never forgotten. Justice, he'd learned, sometimes wears dress blues. Sometimes it speaks with quiet authority and carries the kind of power that comes not from money or position, but from understanding what matters and having the courage to act on that understanding. And sometimes, when you're sitting alone at a defendant's table facing impossible odds, it walks through courtroom doors with perfect timing and a promise that Marines don't leave Marines behind, not in war zones, not in hospitals, and not in places where corporations and expensive suits try to steal from people who've already given more than anyone should have to give. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who showed up when it mattered most, not for glory or gratitude, but because it was the right thing to do? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how they changed your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, stories about ordinary heroes doing extraordinary things, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.